All right, let's go. Number 10. Sepp Allerberger. In the summer of 1943, somewhere in the rubble and mud of the Eastern Front near Orel, a young Austrian private picked up a rifle that didn't belong to him. It had belonged to a Soviet sniper. That sniper was dead. Sepp Allerberger, 19 years old and serving with the German 3rd Mountain Division, had never been trained as a sniper in his life. He was about to become one of the most lethal in the entire German military. Allerberger had joined the Gebirgsjäger, the elite mountain infantry, as an ordinary soldier. The Eastern Front in 1943 was not a place that rewarded ordinary. Soviet forces were pressing hard along a front that stretched thousands of miles, and German units were fighting brutal defensive actions against overwhelming numbers. Most soldiers in Allerberger's position simply tried to survive. He decided to do something more. What followed was relentless and methodical. Operating alone, sometimes for days at a time in no man's land, Allerberger taught himself everything. How to read terrain, how to use camouflage, how to disappear into a landscape that wanted to kill him. Soviet counter-snipers were sent specifically to hunt him. They failed. He was wounded multiple times and returned to his position each time. By the war's end in May 1945, Allerberger had accumulated 257 confirmed kills across the Eastern Front and into Hungary, making him one of only 3 German soldiers in the entire war to surpass 250 confirmed kills. He was awarded the Knight's Cross. His account, documented decades later and published in 2005 by Albrecht Wacker as Sniper on the Eastern Front, remains one of the most detailed records of individual combat survival the war produced. Some soldiers are selected for greatness by the systems that train them. Sepp Allerberger selected himself from a dead man's rifle in a field no one was watching. Number 9. Jack Churchill. On the night of February 27th, 1941, a British commando officer led a raid on the German-occupied Norwegian coastline, armed with a Scottish broadsword, a longbow, and a set of bagpipes. He was not eccentric in the way that made people laugh. He was eccentric in the way that made enemies deeply uncertain about what they were dealing with. His name was Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, and he was one of the most fearless soldiers Britain put into the field. Churchill had been selected for No. 3 Commando, the British Army's newly formed Special Operations Unit, and he brought to that role a philosophy that baffled his contemporaries. He believed the sword, the bow, and the pipes were not theatrical props. They were tools. At Dunkirk in 1940, he reportedly killed a German sergeant with a barbed arrow, believed by military historians to be the last recorded longbow kill in the history of warfare. What made Churchill genuinely extraordinary, beyond the stagecraft, was that his methods worked. In September 1943, at the Salerno bridgehead in Italy, Churchill led a night patrol that captured 42 prisoners, armed with nothing but his broadsword and the particular quality of controlled aggression that he carried into every engagement. His commanding officers stopped trying to explain him and simply pointed him at problems. The Germans eventually caught him. In 1944, at Brac in Yugoslavia, his position was overrun, and he was taken prisoner. He was held at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and later transferred to a facility in the Tyrol. He escaped, walked approximately 150 miles toward Allied lines, and linked up with American forces. He had survived every theater of the war. In an age of mechanized industrial killing, Jack Churchill brought a medieval sword and came out ahead. Some men simply refuse to fight the war they're given and win anyway. Number 8. Lyudmila Pavlichenko. By the summer of 1942, the Germans had given a 25-year-old Soviet woman a nickname. They called her Lady Death. Her real name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She served with the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division of the Soviet Red Army, and she had already killed more enemy soldiers than most decorated officers accumulate across an entire career. She remains, by any measure, the most lethal female sniper in recorded history. Pavlichenko had been a history student at Kiev University when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. She volunteered immediately. The Red Army was reluctant, initially suggesting she might serve as a nurse. She asked to be taken to a rifle range instead, demonstrated her ability, and was assigned to a sniper unit. It was not a decision the German military would look back on with any satisfaction. What followed was harrowing in its precision. Pavlichenko was not simply effective at distance. She specialized in hunting enemy snipers, the most dangerous targets in any theater because they are actively hunting you back. Of her 309 confirmed kills, 36 were enemy snipers. Each of those engagements was a contest between two trained professionals in which only one would survive. She survived all 36. She was wounded 4 times. In June 1942, a shrapnel fragment struck her face and she was removed from the front line, her combat career effectively over. The Soviet government sent her on a propaganda tour of the United States and Canada. She addressed the International Student Assembly in Washington, D.C. Eleanor Roosevelt personally hosted her at the White House, making Pavlichenko one of the first Soviet citizens to be received by a sitting American president. 309 confirmed kills. 36 of them were snipers who had gone into the field specifically to kill her, and every one of them failed. Number 7. Vasily Zaitsev. In November 1942, Stalingrad was barely a city anymore. It was rubble and frozen ground, and the sound of artillery that never stopped. And somewhere inside its ruins, 2 men were hunting each other. One was Vasily Zaitsev, a 27-year-old Soviet sniper from the Ural Mountains who had grown up hunting deer with his grandfather, and was now applying those same instincts to the Battle of Stalingrad. The other was a German expert sent from Berlin with one specific assignment: find Zaitsev and kill him. Zaitsev had arrived at Stalingrad in October 1942 with the 284th Rifle Division as part of the 62nd Army. Within weeks, he had accumulated enough confirmed kills that his name was being broadcast in Soviet military dispatches. The Red Army understood that a legendary sniper was worth more than his kill count. He was a psychological weapon, and in a battle where morale was measured in hours, that mattered enormously. By January 1943, Zaitsev had 225 confirmed kills, with some Soviet records placing the figure higher. He had also trained 28 other snipers, whose combined kills would eventually exceed 3,000. The German High Command, understanding precisely what his presence meant to Soviet troops, dispatched a counter-sniper to neutralize him. Soviet accounts identify this man as Major Koenig of the German Sniper School in Berlin, though Western historians have been unable to confirm that name in German records. The duel was real. The details of the opponent remain uncertain. What is certain is the outcome. Zaitsev was blinded by a mortar shell in January 1943, evacuated, and had his sight restored by the surgeon Vladimir Filatov. He returned to the front. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union in February 1943. His original sniper rifle is preserved today at the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. When one sniper could alter the psychology of an entire battle, what does that say about the weight a single human being is capable of carrying? Number 6. Lauri Turney. Lauri Turney fought the Soviet Union for Finland, then fought the Soviets again as an officer in the German Waffen-SS, then fought the Viet Cong as a United States Army Special Forces captain. He survived all 3 wars. He died on November 18, 1965, when a helicopter went down in Vietnam, and his remains were recovered from the crash site 34 years later, and reburied at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. He was, depending on which uniform you were looking at, either an ally or an enemy, and every army that employed him considered him extraordinary. Turney was born in 1919 in Viipuri, Finland, in what is now the Russian city of Vyborg. He had been commissioned as an officer in the Finnish army and fought in both the Winter War and the Continuation War against the Soviet Union. During the Continuation War, he commanded a long-range patrol unit. Turney's detachment, which operated deep behind Soviet lines in conditions that should have been unsurvivable, holding positions for days against forces that vastly outnumbered his men before extracting them intact. His record was unyielding, and his methods were ferocious. Finland awarded him the Mannerheim Cross in 1944, the country's highest military honor. He subsequently served in the Waffen-SS, training further behind German lines as the Finnish front collapsed. After the war, he was captured by Soviet-aligned Finnish authorities, escaped twice, and eventually made his way to the United States, where he was naturalized as an American citizen under the Lodge Act in 1954 and entered the Special Forces under the name Larry Thorne. 3 armies, 3 wars, 3 decades of continuous combat. When American recovery teams found his remains in a Vietnamese jungle in 1999, DNA testing confirmed his identity, and the United States military buried him at Arlington because no single country had a stronger claim on him than all of them combined. Some soldiers belonged to one nation. Laurie Turney belonged to the idea of the fight itself, and 3 different flags could not contain him. Number 5. John Basilone. On the night of October 24, 1942, roughly 3,000 soldiers of the Japanese Sendai Division launched a coordinated assault on the American perimeter at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. They came in successive waves through darkness and rain, and they struck the section of line held by Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, with 2 machine guns, a handful of men, and 16 hours until daylight. What happened next became one of the most decorated single actions in the history of the United States Marine Corps. Basilone had been born on November 4, 1916, in Buffalo, New York, and had enlisted in the Army as a teenager before later joining the Marines. By October 1942, he was 25 years old and experienced enough to understand exactly how bad his situation was. The Japanese assault was not a probe. It was an attempt to overrun the airfield and break American control of the island. The mathematics were not in his favor. He kept firing. When his ammunition ran out, he physically carried heavy supply loads through 200 yards of active Japanese fire to resupply his guns. When one gun jammed, he repaired it under direct fire. He repositioned, redirected his men, and held the line through the night. The assault, which had been designed to destroy that section of the American perimeter, collapsed. His Medal of Honor citation states that he contributed essentially to the virtual annihilation of a Japanese regiment. The Marine Corps brought him home and made him a war bond poster. He toured the country, was photographed endlessly, and was offered a permanent stateside assignment that would have kept him safe for the rest of the war. He turned it down. He said he belonged with his men. On February 19, 1945, the first morning of the Battle of Iwo Jima, a Japanese mortar found him. He was 28 years old. He could have spent the rest of the war selling bonds. He chose Iwo Jima instead, and some men simply cannot be anything other than what they are. Number 4. Charles Upham. The Victoria Cross has been awarded fewer than 1,400 times across the entire history of the British Commonwealth, in every war, on every continent, across more than a century and a half of combat. Charles Upham won it twice, in the same war, in active combat, and the second time he was so severely wounded that he should have been physically incapable of the actions for which it was awarded. He remains the only combat soldier in history to receive the Victoria Cross and Bar, and no one who has studied his record has ever seriously suggested the honors were anything other than inadequate. Upham was born on September 21, 1908, in Christchurch, New Zealand, and was a farmer and musterer before the war. He was commissioned into the 20th Battalion of the 2nd New Zealand Division and deployed to the Mediterranean Theater. His first Victoria Cross was awarded for a series of actions during the Battle of Crete in May 1941, fought across 10 brutal days of retreat and rearguard combat, in which he personally destroyed a German mortar crew, cleared multiple defended positions, and killed approximately 22 enemy soldiers while suffering from dysentery so severe he could barely stand upright. His second came at El Ruwaysat Ridge in the North African desert in July 1942. He led an attack on German armored positions, was wounded twice during the assault, and had his arm shattered by a grenade. He continued to fight. He carried wounded men. He held his position. Only when the engagement was over and the ground was secured did he allow himself to be taken prisoner by German forces, who classified him as a dangerous captive and eventually transferred him to Colditz Castle, from which he attempted to escape 4 times. He survived the war. When New Zealand raised a public subscription of £10,000 as a gift to him, he donated every pound to an educational trust for the children of returned servicemen. He then went back to farming and refused to discuss his medals for the rest of his life. The Germans called him one of the most dangerous prisoners they held. His country called him its greatest soldier. He called himself a farmer, and he was probably the only one of them telling the complete truth. Number 3. Witold Pilecki. In September 1940, a Polish resistance fighter walked up to a German street roundup in Warsaw and allowed himself to be arrested. He was not caught. He chose this. He had forged identity documents in the name of Tomasz Serafiński, and he used them to gain entry to a place that the rest of the world would spend years trying to comprehend. He was transported to Auschwitz on September 22, 1940. He went voluntarily, and he went because someone needed to find out what was happening inside, and Witold Pilecki had decided that someone would be him. Pilecki was born on May 13, 1901, in Oleniec, in what was then the Russian Empire, and had served as an officer in the Polish army before the German occupation. He was a member of the Armia Krajowa, the Polish underground home army, and it was on behalf of that organization that he made the choice that defines his entire legacy. He understood he might not come back. He went anyway. What he built inside Auschwitz was extraordinary. Over 945 days, he organized a resistance network called the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, which at its peak had approximately 1,000 members distributed across multiple blocks of the camp. He gathered testimony. He documented the systematic murder taking place around him. He smuggled at least 3 detailed intelligence reports to the Polish government in exile in London, reports that contained some of the earliest documentary evidence of the Holocaust to reach the West. He escaped on April 27, 1943, and fought in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. He survived German captivity. He survived the entire war. In 1947, the communist government that had replaced the Poland he had fought to restore arrested him on fabricated charges of espionage. He was executed on May 25, 1948, by a single shot to the back of the head. He was rehabilitated posthumously by Polish courts in 1990 and awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest honor, in 2006. He survived Auschwitz. He survived the Warsaw Uprising. He survived German captivity. It was his own government, the one he had bled to restore, that finally killed him, and history has not forgiven that. Number 2, Audie Murphy. On January 26, 1945, near the French town of Holtzwihr in the Alsace region, 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy ordered his men to pull back into the tree line and then climbed alone onto a burning tank destroyer that had already taken a direct hit from German fire. The vehicle's fuel and ammunition could have detonated at any moment. Advancing toward him through the snow were approximately 250 German infantry soldiers and 6 tanks. He found the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the hull, got behind it, and started shooting. Murphy had been born on June 20th, 1924, in Kingston, Texas, the 7th of 12 children of a sharecropper. He had tried to enlist in the Marine Corps after Pearl Harbor. They rejected him, small stature and underage. The Navy rejected him. The paratroopers rejected him. The Army accepted him, and he was eventually assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, which would see some of the heaviest fighting of the entire European campaign. What happened at Holtzwihr lasted approximately 1 hour. Murphy held the burning tank destroyer's telephone line to American artillery and used it throughout the engagement, calling in fire coordinates while simultaneously operating the machine gun, directing shells to within 40 yards of his own position. He had taken a wound to the leg. He kept firing. When his ammunition was finally exhausted, he climbed down, rejoined his men, and led a successful counterattack that drove the Germans back. The citation for his Medal of Honor describes a force of overwhelming numerical superiority repulsed by one wounded lieutenant on a burning vehicle. He was 21 years old when the war ended. He came home the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War, carrying 33 military decorations, including the Medal of Honor, 3 Purple Hearts, and 2 Silver Stars. He couldn't sleep. He kept a loaded pistol under his pillow. He spoke publicly about what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder at a time when the military establishment considered such conversations a form of weakness. And he did so while Hollywood was simultaneously paying him to make war look heroic. The man who held off 250 soldiers from a burning vehicle spent the rest of his life trying to tell the truth about what war actually costs, and the country that made him a legend never quite knew what to do with that. Number 1. Hiroo Onoda. In January 1974, a Philippine government search team made contact with a Japanese soldier in the dense jungle of Lubang Island, approximately 75 miles southwest of Manila. He was armed. He was in uniform. He was combat ready and completely hostile. The war, he informed them, was still in progress. His name was Hiroo Onoda. The Second World War had ended on September 2nd, 1945. He had been fighting alone in that jungle for 29 years. Onoda had been born on March 19th, 1922, in Kamikawa, Wakayama Prefecture, Japan, and had been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army Intelligence Corps. He was deployed to Lubang Island in December 1944 with orders that his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, stated in the clearest possible terms. He was never to surrender, never to take his own life, and never to abandon his post, regardless of what he heard or was told. Those orders were given in good faith, in the context of a war that was still being fought. Neither man could have known what they would eventually mean. His unit had originally comprised 4 soldiers. One surrendered to Philippine authorities in 1950. Another was killed in a skirmish in 1954. The last, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, was shot and killed by a search party in 1972. By then, Onoda had been alone for years, and the jungle had become the only world he trusted. Philippine and Japanese authorities had made repeated attempts to reach him across the decades, dropping leaflets from aircraft, broadcasting messages by loudspeaker, delivering letters from his family, and photographs of his relatives. He dismissed every one of them as enemy deception. He had been trained to expect exactly these kinds of psychological operations, and his training held. During his 29 years on Lubang, Onoda engaged in skirmishes that killed approximately 30 Filipino civilians and policemen and wounded approximately 100 others. He was not delusional. He was not mentally unwell. He was precisely what the Imperial Japanese military had spent years trying to produce. A soldier whose loyalty was absolute, whose discipline was total, and whose capacity to endure was by any measure without precedent. The tragedy was not that his training had failed. The tragedy was that it had worked perfectly, long after the purpose it was built to serve had ceased to exist. He finally surrendered on March 9th, 1974, and only because the one thing that could reach him had been found. His former commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, now elderly and retired from military life, personally traveled to Lubang Island and stood before Onoda in the jungle and formally, officially relieved him of duty. Onoda emerged in full uniform, carrying his service rifle, still functional after 3 decades of careful maintenance, his military sword, several hand grenades, and 500 rounds of ammunition. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos pardoned him. Japan received him with a reception that mixed reverence and grief in proportions that no official ceremony could quite balance. He subsequently moved to Brazil, later returned to Japan, and spent his final years running an outdoor school for young people, teaching wilderness survival. He died on January 16, 2014, aged 91. On March 9, 1974, Hiru Onoda laid down a rifle he had carried for 29 years, saluted a commanding officer who had come out of retirement to release him, and walked out of a jungle that had been his entire world since 1945. He had not failed in his duty. His duty had simply outlasted everything that gave it meaning, and in that, his story does not belong to the category of last stands at all. It belongs to something older and stranger and more unsettling, the portrait of a man so completely shaped by a purpose that when the purpose disappeared, the man simply continued, alone, resolute, and utterly unconquerable in a war that existed only inside him. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.